Hello, it's Jake again, and in this video, we'll be talking about demand, the first part of our supply and demand. So, what is demand? Demand refers to the mapping between the price of a good or service and the amount that the consumer wants to buy at that price. And you can think of it as a pair of a price and a quantity, like 12 eggs at 50 cents an egg, or two cars at $20,000 a car, or four polo shirts at $20 a shirt. And the quantity is going to be referred to as the quantity demanded, whereas the demand is going to be all of the possible combinations of price and quantity demanded. The distinction matters. Now, I know what you all are like. I know from experience. You're going to ignore me. You're going to blow me off. But there is a reason why we use these two specific terms. It's not just pedantry. But you're not going to get to the reason until the equilibrium topic a few lectures in. For now, just try to drill this into your head. Quantity demanded is the quantity you're buying at a price. Demand are all of the price quantity combinations that a person can have. Now, demand is generally assumed to follow a so-called law of demand. As the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded will fall or stay the same. If you make something more expensive, people buy less of it, or they want to buy less of it. If you make something cheaper, people will want to buy more of it. And law in this case is meant in the same sense as the laws of nature, like from physics. It's not a legal law. There's no regulatory body that says that when the price goes up, you're not allowed to buy as much. And this isn't a prescriptive law either. It's not a moral thing that economics says you should buy less of something if the price goes up. It's a law in that this is something that we see people doing very reliably to the point that we can compare it to a law of nature in its reliability. We, as economists, can have faith that people will do this with nearly the same certainty that a physicist has faith that gravity will continue to hold us to the earth every day. And graphically, this is the same as the demand curve being downward sloped. Now, why? Well, the simplest argument is going to revolve around a concept called the principle of diminishing returns, or the principle of diminishing marginal returns, which holds that as the amount of an input goes up, the marginal benefit of that input goes down. The more of something you have, the less useful more of it is. When you add something, you wouldn't expect it to be a negative, but you do expect that unit to be less useful than the unit before it. Well, let's illustrate this with some examples. So, I got this office mate. His name's Krishna Sharma. He's from Nepal. Now, a lot of my colleagues, because I'm a graduate student, a lot of my colleagues are foreign students, mostly from India, Bangladesh, and the People's Republic of China. And most of them don't own cars. They don't own cars in their homeland, so they sure as heck don't own cars over here. But as you all know, it's about impossible to live a decent life in America without a car. We don't build our cities around pedestrians. We don't have public transportation like other countries do. Every time my car breaks, it's a huge pain in the ass for me because I have to hoof it on my bicycle, and this whole town is built out of nothing but giant hills. Now, Krishna, he finally went through the process. He finally got his driver's license, learned how to drive, is teaching some of the other ones to drive, and he buys himself a car. Now, can you imagine what a huge difference that would make in his life? Now he doesn't have to have his groceries delivered to his door and pay a very high delivery fee. Now, if he wants to go somewhere, he doesn't have to bum a ride off of one of us or pay, some overpriced Uber driver that's not going to get there for an hour. Now, if he wants to go to Greenville, he doesn't have to hitch a ride on the bus and plan his whole trip out around the bus schedule. Having a car liberates you. It's a huge improvement in the quality of his life. And you could imagine that Krishna would have been willing to pay a fairly high price to get that first car. Well, getting a new car wasn't Krishna's only major life change, because not too much longer after that, he got married to a woman from Nepal, arranged marriage. Well, she's not a car owner, so there's two people in the family now, two people in the Sharma household. Only one of them's a driver, though. So they've got to share. If they want to go to the store, they can go to the store. If they want to go to Greenville, they can go to Greenville. But they can't both take the car at the same time in opposite directions. If one of them needs a ride somewhere, the other one's got to go with them. So imagine, say Krishna graduates from here. We don't really call it graduating in graduate school, but you know what I mean. Suppose he finishes up, defends his dissertation, gets himself a good job, and he buys a second car. Well, that'd be a real relief, wouldn't it? Now the missus can go grocery shopping while he goes to work. Now they're not shackled to each other. And if one of their cars breaks down, they still have a backup car. Be pretty convenient. It would be a decent improvement in the quality of their life. But it probably wouldn't be as big of an improvement in their life as that first car would it? There's no way it could. Having a car, the difference between no cars and a car, is by necessity going to be dramatically more than the difference between one car and two cars. But he might still be willing to buy one. He's probably not going to pay as much for it, right? But he has a higher income. He finds a cheaper used one. He might get a second. And then, we have unlimited desires, so maybe he starts to think about a third. But by the time you're talking about a third car, the benefits of additional car ownership have really started to fall, haven't they? It's not like a third car is going to add any functionality to the household that the first or second didn't. I mean, once you're at one car per person, one car per driver, you don't really have any legitimate need for another one. Well, you might want to get a status symbol. Maybe he saves up his money, gets old enough to have a midlife crisis, wants to go get a fancy sports car. But you see how the usefulness of it would fall off dramatically, and so the willingness to pay for such a thing would also be expected to fall off. Now, for me, I'm not really a car person, but I am into suits. I don't wear them when I do this, but when I lecture in person in fall and spring, I wear three-piece suits. Now, pretty much every man needs a suit, right? At some point, you're going to have an interview. Well, you may not, right? You may go into an occupation that doesn't do that crap, but many people, they might have an interview where they're expected to dress up. You've got weddings to go to, you've got funerals to go to, you've got church to go to. Every man needs to have a suit. And then, for many people, they could benefit from another suit. Now, you've already got a suit. You already have something for those occasions that demand it. But if you're like me, I go to these conferences and colloquia and stuff. You're expected to dress up. Well, you can wear the same suit, for several days in a row, but that's kind of lame. Doesn't look good to do that. And especially if you're going to be wearing suits much of the time, you'd like to have a little bit of variety in your appearance, more colors. There's a rule of thumb, isn't there? Your first suit, you get gray or black. Your second suit, you get navy blue. Your third suit, you get brown. Well, that second suit, that could still be worth getting, but it's not going to be as much of a priority as the first one, will it? Then you start thinking about a third suit. How important is a third suit going to be? Not very, will it? See, this is true of most goods. I won't say it's true of every good, but it's true of the vast majority of goods. The more of something you have, the less useful another of it is, the less useful a marginal unit of it is going to be. And because of that, you aren't willing to pay as much for the next unit. And if we're talking about goods that are bought to make other goods, we have a technical term for these kinds of resources, and we call them factors of production. So think machinery, land, raw resources that wind up part of the finished product, like plastic and wood and metal. If it's a good like that, then the marginal benefit of it is going to be the marginal revenue it would raise. The extra output times the price of the output. I'm buying this thing to make something else to sell it, so I care about how much money it's going to bring in. And for reasons we'll see in the supply video, the next one, we would expect that to also have diminishing returns. Now, due to the marginal principle, the price at each quantity is going to be the maximum willingness to pay or the marginal benefit of that last unit. And you can think of why this would be true using a sort of quick proof by contradiction. So let's consider if it were not true. Now, when you're buying a good, the price is at least part of the cost. There can be additional cost to buying it besides the price, but definitely any money you hand over is certainly a cost. And so, first, let's think about what if the marginal benefits were lower than the price? Well, if the marginal benefit is lower than the price, the marginal benefit is lower than the marginal costs for sure, which means that you would not have bought that quantity if you were following the marginal principle. So you have a contradiction there. The quantity demanded could not be that high, and yet the marginal principle still hold. Likewise, suppose if the marginal benefits were greater than the price. Well, in that case, the marginal principle would say that you would want to buy more of the good. And thus you would buy more of the good. And so the quantity demanded, the quantity you would buy would be greater than the quantity demanded. You'd get another contradiction. If the marginal principle holds, if you assume that it holds, then that price at each quantity has to be the maximum willingness to pay of the last unit. Because if it were not, you would not have bought that many units. And thus we can interpret the marginal benefits of consumption from the demand curve. And so, if marginal benefits tend to decline as the quantity increases, for the reason I just gave, you would likewise expect the demand curve to slope downwards. as it does in that graph. Now, does the law of demand always hold? Not necessarily. Like I said, economic laws are not really they're not true laws in the sense that the laws of physics are laws, and they're not legal laws. They're more empirical regularities. And there are two specific types of goods that are theorized to exist that could violate the law of demand. Now, one of these, called Veblen goods, named after the economist who proposed them, are your status symbols. They're the things that people buy specifically because they're expensive. And then the other type, much, much more interesting, are so-called Giffen goods, goods which violate the law of demand because of poverty and necessity. And the argument's a little complicated, but what it comes down to is that the good is such a necessity and the consumer is so poor that if the price of it goes up, the consumer can't afford other things. They have to buy it, and so they get priced out of buying alternatives. But here's the big thing. Nobody has proven that these exist. There's always an economist somewhere looking for an example, because that's like the holy grail, right? Everyone wants to be the man that proved that the law of demand isn't true. Nobody's done it. Usually with Giffen goods, most of the alleged examples involve some kind of staple crop that very poor people buy. Usually it's either rice in China or it's potatoes in Ireland back during the potato famine. But both of those studies, they had severe flaws with them that they couldn't conclusively prove that they actually did violate the law of demand. On the PowerPoint, it says that there might be one section of homework dealing with that. I might cut it, but in this course, we're pretty much always going to be talking about ordinary goods, goods that do obey the law. So I tell you about Veblen goods and Giffen goods just because that's a common question. You know, people want to know, what about when the law gets violated? But the answer is, if it gets violated, it's such a rare, exceptional event that it has no bearing on our lives. It's something that is so it's more or less purely theoretical, and it has no relevance to the rest of the class. Now, demand for a given good is going to depend on how we define the good, the market, and the time period. So, for example, moving from more to less specific, we could talk about food as a good, or we could talk about packaged food or cereal or brand cereal or Raisin Bran. And we could be talking about that specific product at the global level or the national level, state markets, county markets, an individual block, even individual demand, the demand of one person for it. And that time frame can also change. Annual demand for a good, monthly demand, weekly demand, daily, hourly. The scale that you use is going to depend on the kind of question that you're asking. So, for example, if you were concerned with, say, the impact that an increase in milk prices has on the sale of cereal, then the relevant scale would be to talk about cereal as your good. But if your question was something like, does putting a cartoon character on the box increase sales of a given cereal? Then the relevant scale would be the individual brand, like Raisin Bran. Likewise, what question you're asking is going to determine how specific you need to be in time or space. With some products, they have yearly cycles to their production, right? Most crops, well, many crops they can do multiple harvests in a year, but you see how with crops, often we talk about planting year to year. But on the other hand, with some things like stocks, we see that the prices change wildly from minute to minute, from second to second, even. So understand that when we talk about demand, there are no like fixed categories for these products. It's going to depend on what we're asking. And market demand can be found by just summing up the individual demands. So you see down here, I'm still getting used to using Zoom and all its functionality. I've got a graph there that shows you how demand changes as more consumers enter the market. At one consumer, you have a certain quantity. At two consumers, you have more. At three consumers, you have more. The individual demands are the same, but if we're counting more people, then the quantity is going to be higher just because there are more people. Now, what determines the shape of a demand curve? Anything that determines how much the consumer desires it, as well as however many customers there are. Remember, as I told you, you can read the marginal benefits of the good off of the demand curve. And so whatever determines the benefits of the curve are going to determine the curve shape. Whatever makes that good desirable determines its shape. How desirable is it at each level? And you might want to ask, what causes demand to change? So now we'll start to talk about demand shocks. See, a demand shock is an event which causes the demand curve to move. And these come in two types: positive shocks and negative shocks. And positive shocks are going to be shocks which increase the quantity, while negative shocks are going to mayday, mayday. 1, 2, 3. So, demand shocks are going to be events which cause the demand curve to move. And these come in two types, positive and negative, and they're just opposites of each other. Now, positive shocks will increase the marginal benefit of the good, meaning that the demand shifts up and to the right. You're willing to pay more for the product. While negative shocks decrease the marginal benefit of the good, meaning that the demand shifts down and to the left. And there are 4 ways that we can classify goods based on their demand shocks. So first, a good can be normal or inferior. Now, normal goods are goods for which demand increases when income increases. And why? Well, if you have more income, you can afford more of the good. So think of things like steaks, craft beers, cars, smartphones, and concert tickets. Most goods are going to be normal. And you might think, what are some things that you would buy more of if you had the money? Now, on the other hand, inferior goods are goods for which demand decreases when income goes up. And usually we think of these as being low quality goods, things you only buy because you cannot afford better. So, some cliche examples would include Hamburger Helper, Bud Light, bus fare, and flip phones. And you might imagine some examples from your own lives. You all are college students, so I imagine you have plenty. But with these normal and inferior goods, shocks to them happen due to changes in income. If income goes up, then demand for normal goods will go up. It'll have a positive shock. But demand for inferior goods will fall. They'll have a negative shock. And that term inferior, it sounds judgmental, and it is, because there's nothing that says that a good has to be bad quality to be an inferior good. But the fact that people don't buy more of it when they get wealthier, there's only one real reason why that would be the case, and that would be that it's garbage. It's garbage that rich people wouldn't buy. So any good is going to be normal or inferior, with most goods being normal. But goods also have relationships to each other. See, any two goods can be substitutes or they can be complements. Now, if good X is a substitute for good Y, that means that when the price of good X increases, demand for good Y also increases. So, for example, if prices of butter were to go up dramatically, you would expect people to switch away from butter and towards margarine. And we call them substitutes because this usually implies that X and Y have a similar use. So if one becomes less affordable, you use more of the other. And you might ask, what are some more substitutes? Well, one common cliche is tea and coffee. Now, they're not as similar to each other as butter and margarine. Margarine was invented specifically to replace butter. Yet they do have a lot of similarities, don't they? They're both hot beverages. They're both stimulants. They're both caffeinated hot beverages. Meow. And thus, if one were to become more expensive, you would expect people would drink more of the other. Now, on the other hand, with complements, it's the opposite. If good X is a complement to good Y, then if the price of good X goes up, the demand for good Y falls. And we call them complements because this usually implies that X and Y go together. The benefits you get from one depend on how much you have of the other, to the point where if you buy less of one, you're not going to want as much as the other since you don't have both, to go with each other. So some examples of complements would be things like French fries and ketchup, ground chuck and hamburger buns. I use a lot of food examples because most of your fun, easily understandable substitutes and complements come from food. I mean, you can use ketchup with a lot of things besides French fries. But I'd wager that most of the ketchup that's eaten is eaten with French fries. Likewise, there's uses for hamburger buns besides ground chuck. You might make a fish sandwich. You might use the ground chuck to make tacos. But much of the time, you buy the two to go together. So if one becomes more expensive, you cut back on it because it obeys the law of demand, which means you then cut back on the other because its value to you has fallen. Now, demand will also increase with population. People may be buying the same amount per person, but there are more people, and so there's more buying. And demand also responds to future expectations about prices, availability, and usefulness of the good. See, if people are afraid of not being able to get the good, of having to pay a higher price in the future, or the good becoming more valuable in some other way, they'll hoard it. You remember a certain product that happened to in living memory? Yep, I know, it's a cliche. That's the problem with these things. You have to go through and come up with new examples every now and then if you try to make them timely. COVID toilet paper. Well, the benefits of having toilet paper right now didn't exactly change, but people expected the more distant benefits to increase. They expected to not be able to get any. And a self-fulfilling prophecy, they made that reality. Everyone panicked, everyone started hoarding. Doing it because even though the price may have been low, even though the shelves may have been stocked, they were afraid that they wouldn't remain stocked. There's a much darker example of this happening. Gun sales and bullet sales always shoot through the roof anytime there's an election. It's not just in America that this happens either. Although usually it's third world countries where that happens. But anytime people are afraid of civil disorder in the country or of a gun grabbing program, gun sales always shoot up as a consequence because they think, oh, I've got to get mine before I can't get one. But in conclusion, the law of demand states that as prices rise, the quantity demanded of a product will fall or stay the same. Any good can be normal or inferior, with normal meaning that raising income will raise demand, inferior meaning that raising income will lower demand. Any two goods can be substitutes or complements. With substitutes, if you raise the price of one, that raises demand for the other because people switch to it to avoid the price hike. With complements, raising the price of one lowers demand for the other because they go together. So if you're buying less of one, you buy less of the other one too. Most goods are going to be normal, and most pairs of goods will be substitutes. If you can't think of any direct relationship between two things, you can kind of assume that they're substitutes. Like they don't have a connection, they don't compete, but if you buy less of something, that frees up your money to buy more of other things. The demand curve is a mapping of prices to quantities, and it shows us the maximum willingness to pay for each marginal unit. And anything that makes the good more attractive, that increases its marginal benefits, its maximum willingness to pay, will increase demand. If it makes it less attractive, it will decrease demand. And this includes expectations about the future. Now, in the next video, we'll go over how supply, the mirror image of demand, works. And then, well, actually, we have another video after that. But what this is all building up towards is when we put the two together to find out where prices come from.